right. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for attending. My name is Bill Houghton. I am, as Michelle said, the founder of Sensible Surrogacy and a two-time surrogate father myself. And today we're going to be talking about secure and affordable surrogacy in 5 simple steps. Now, I think that probably everybody who's attending has given some thought and some serious consideration about a possible surrogacy journey to expand their family. And maybe you didn't continue the journey, or maybe you sort of got bogged down thinking that this was too complex, that maybe it was too expensive, or maybe it was just unsafe or too risky. And so what I want to do in this first webinar of the series is to sort of bring some light into how the process works, how it can be affordable, and how costs work, and in a simple framework that's easy to understand, so that people can make a more clear decision about whether or not this is something that's right for them. Right. So let's get to it. So before you begin your journey, there's always a couple of questions, right? So before we get into the 5 steps of your journey, we need to think about a few decisions that need to be made. And the first one is going to be, is this a process that you're willing to do yourself, really as an independent, what we'd call an independent surrogacy journey? Or is this something that you're going to need an agency to assist you with? Now, an independent journey really means that you are going to go out and find a surrogate, and you're going to build a relationship with her and manage the journey on your own directly with her and in partnership with her. And that means that in addition to, to finding your surrogate, you're also going to work with her to arrange all of the medical procedures, all of her appointments with the clinic, all of her travel if she needs to travel. You're going to arrange for her compensation and make sure she's getting paid correctly. You're going to be working with the lawyers to draft her contract and negotiate the terms of her contract. So that is no small task, right? But a lot of people do it actually on a regular basis. Independent journey is definitely feasible if you feel like it's something that you have the time and you have the energy and the organizational skills to do that. The agency, on the other hand, has a lot of benefits. And one of the great benefits of an agency is that they have sort of a professional team that can go out and find your surrogate for you, right? And introduce you to possible candidates and then manage her completely throughout the process, right? That means that they're the ones who are going to get the middle of the night phone call, when your surrogate starts feeling cramps, right? Or they're the ones who are going to get the phone call when she misses her flight on the way to the clinic. So the answer to indie versus agency is really a question about how capable you feel about organizing and carrying out what is going to be a year-long complex logistical program. Agency fees are steep, right? The typical agency fee is anywhere from $15,000 to $30,000. So if you do an independent journey, there's definitely a cost savings there, but be prepared. It is a lot of work, and a lot of expertise is involved in that process. The second question is going to be where to have your surrogacy journey. Now, if you're doing an independent journey, probably you're going to be doing it in your home country because you really need to be accessible to your surrogate, right? She needs to call you at any time when she's having a problem, whether it's the middle of the night or not. So doing an independent surrogacy journey when you are on the other side of an ocean, not really a workable solution. But let's assume for a moment that you are living in the United States and you are considering options around the world. Well, you can look at the possible destinations for surrogacy really in 3 different buckets, I like to say, 3 different categories. And the first are countries where there is a legal framework in place. And these are quite a small handful of countries. This would be like the United States and Canada, the Ukraine, the UK has a legal framework in place. And these countries are sort of the gold star options. This is where you are going to be the most protected and the most secure because there's a local legal framework that is going to establish your parental rights. They're going to dictate the terms of the arrangement between you and the surrogate. And if anything goes wrong, sort of you have sort of the law to fall back on, right? So always, aim for a legal destination if you can. The second group are what we would call unregulated jurisdictions. And these are places that you've probably read about or heard about online that have no laws whatsoever, but they're still doing surrogacy programs there, typically because there's no law. Anybody can do surrogacy, right? It's not prohibited, so you can just go and do it, and it's unregulated. These are places like Mexico or Kenya or Guatemala have sort of appeared as very popular destinations. But the problem with an unregulated jurisdiction is that without the benefit of a legal framework, your surrogacy contract is really nothing more than a handshake, right? It is completely unenforceable under the law because there is no law. And so the surrogate is completely free to change her mind at any time. So what I advise is for couples to stay away from unregulated jurisdictions because there isn't a protection of the law and your surrogacy contract really isn't going to be very valid. The other problem with unregulated jurisdictions, and quite frankly, this is the biggest one, is that at any time, if there's no law, at any time, the government can just decide to pass a law. And this is what we saw in Thailand, for example, or what we saw in Cambodia, where there was no law in place, and then some media storm around a scandal broke out. And overnight, the government just decided to regulate surrogacy as if it was human trafficking. And then suddenly, with no notice, everybody who was involved in a surrogacy journey was culpable of a human trafficking offense. And I was in Thailand when that happened, and let me tell you, it was a mess because surrogates scattered, they were hiding from the police, people were trying to smuggle their babies out of the country. It was absolutely a disaster. So unregulated jurisdictions are a problem in a lot of respects. If you are a same-sex couple, there are what I would say are illicit programs that are available that you've probably read about. And this would be, for example, in Russia or Ukraine, where you can possibly sort of use the local infrastructure, the local clinics, and the availability of surrogates to do a program, even though technically you are restricted by law, right? In a place like Russia or Ukraine, you have to be a heterosexual married couple to do surrogacy. But under an illicit program, you can pretend to be in a relationship with your surrogate and present yourself as a couple, and then sort of sidestep the local legislation. Again, not really a good idea, and I know some people who have done this and some people who have done this successfully, but there is a fine line between a valid legal surrogacy agreement and a human trafficking charge, right? And you don't want to run afoul of that line. So the best advice I can give as far as the legality is always go to a destination where there is a solid legal framework, where surrogacy is considered a viable form of family building, and you don't want to get on the wrong side of the law because that is a huge, huge issue. The final point you want to consider before we get into starting your journey is choosing a budget. And this goes hand in hand with choosing a destination. Costs in the United States, the US is clearly sort of the gold star option in terms of surrogacy destinations, right? The laws are very favorable in those states that do surrogacy, like California or Nevada. And the process is streamlined, it's well practiced, and the laws will put you on the birth certificate as soon as the baby is born, and that's great. But that kind of convenience comes at a cost, and the cost in the US is high. About $110,000 is about the minimum that you'd expect to pay for a surrogacy journey in the US. And that goes all the way up to about $160,000 or even more in some cases. But in addition to that, what you should be aware of when you set a budget for a program in the United States is that beyond just that original $110,000, there are additional costs that are sort of unique to the US. The US medical care system is convoluted, right? And the insurance market is unbelievably complicated. So you can expect that there are possible additional medical expenses that are going to be on top of that. And health insurance is going to be on top of that too. Health insurance is going to run you anywhere from $600 to $1,200 a month for your surrogate. And if you're from overseas and you don't have a private health policy in the United States already, you can expect to buy insurance for your newborn. And that is going to run you $10,000, $20,000, depending on your specific situation. So insurance and medical expenses in the US, very, very complicated, let's say. We'll leave it at that. It's complicated, but you should consider those to be additional expenses on top of the $110,000 that your journey is going to cost. Now, compare that to programs abroad, and I know a lot of people are uncomfortable thinking about doing a surrogacy program abroad, but the truth is there are countries with great legal frameworks that are very safe, very secure, and are very well practiced, and the cost is about half. $80,000 is what you should expect to pay in a program in Canada or in Greece or in the UK, or even in Mexico. And I'm not crazy about Mexico because it's not really regulated, but $80,000 is sort of the ballpark figure in those countries. If you go to a country like Ukraine or Colombia or Georgia, you can expect to pay about $50,000. So take into consideration the budget, what you're willing to pay, what you can afford, what you can finance before you begin step one, right? And step one is conceiving your embryos, right? This is the first step of any surrogacy journey. And if you've been through high school biology, you know how this works, right? You have a man who's going to donate sperm, and you have a woman who's going to donate eggs, and the clinic is going to put those two together, and they're going to create embryos, right? And that is really what you need to know about step number one. Doesn't get much simpler than that. But beyond that, here's what you should know. First of all, you should decide if you are capable of donating yourself. Now, a sperm donor is easy. And frankly, the bar for sperm donors is really low. The WHO, the World Health Organization, puts the international average for normal sperm morphology at about 4%, right? 4%. So it's very unusual that a man is unable to reach that bar. But even so, if your sperm count is really poor for some reason, typical IVF cycles now use a program called ICSI, a technique called ICSI, where they take a single sperm cell and they inject it into the egg. And so you don't really need a massive amount of healthy sperm. You just need a handful. And so I would recommend that you could be a sperm donor even if your morphology was 2%, right? Not a problem. The egg donor, however, is a little bit more complicated, right? Egg donors are really the key to the success of your surrogacy program. And before you decide that you're going to donate or that a friend is going to donate, you need to do some medical tests. And what we're looking for is basically a hormone scan that at the beginning of your natural cycle that shows that you are producing eggs, right? And the best way to do that is there's two hormones. There's actually a series of hormones, but the two big ones that we look for are your AMH score, which should be greater than 1. The higher the AMH score means the more eggs you're producing. The FSH score should be less than 10, and that's an indication that your eggs are going to be healthy and mature, right? So we're looking for those two numbers when you do a simple sort of fertility hormone scan. And by the way, any fertility clinic or hospital with an IVF department can do that blood test for you. In addition to the blood test, I also recommend that you do an ovarian ultrasound, and this is a simple ultrasound that checks to actually visibly look for eggs in the ovaries to make sure that they are there and ready to be retrieved, right? So the combination of those two is really what's going to qualify you as a donor. And if you run short on either of those, you should really reconsider using either your eggs or that particular donor, and you should look for a different donor. Now, the donation process itself, not complicated. If you're a sperm donor, well, it takes an hour, right? I mean, we all are aware of how simple that process is. Egg donation is more complicated, obviously. That takes about 2 weeks. And your egg donor is basically going to start a process that we call stimulation, ovarian stimulation. And these are a series of hormone injections that are just designed to mature the eggs that are in her ovaries. A woman's typical cycle releases one mature egg every month. But there are multiple eggs in the ovaries, right, that are ready to be released. And what the stimulation program does is it just forces more of those eggs to mature at the same time. So instead of just getting one during that month, you could get 12 or 20 during that month. And that's the stimulation protocol that takes 2 weeks worth of daily injections. Now, once the egg donor is ready, she goes through a retrieval process. There's a long catheter that's inserted, and the eggs are pulled out, and they are immediately, once they are retrieved, they are immediately fertilized with the sperm that the donor has left, and they are put into into an incubation chamber, and the egg and sperm come together to create the embryo, and the embryo is allowed to develop for typically 5 days. Right? 5 days is what we're looking for, and at the end of 5 days, we should reach what we would call a blastocyst. And a blast, as embryos evolve, as they develop, they go through multiple phases. And the phase that's just before the embryo is getting ready to hatch into a fetus. And what we're looking for at day 5 is for all of your embryos, or the most of your embryos, to reach the blastocyst stage, at which point they are taken out of the incubation chamber and they are frozen, a process that we call vitrification, right? And basically they're just frozen for later use, right? And that's as simple as it is, right? The embryos are fertilized, they're left to sit for 5 days, and then the good ones are frozen. At this point, you can also, before they're frozen, you can decide that you want to do a PGS analysis, which is a really common test. And a lot of clinics vary on whether or not they recommend this on a regular basis. But PGS is a check for the chromosomes of the embryos. And it actually requires taking a cell out of the embryo and testing the chromosomes to make sure the chromosomes are all there. It's a test for things like Down syndrome. You'll find out if there's a missing chromosome that could result in Down syndrome. It'll also check the chromosomes to make sure the chromosomes are all well formed and complete. If you remember your high school biology, chromosomes are long strings of proteins, and sometimes those long strings get tangled up and are just badly shaped. And if that happens, then the embryo doesn't get the information from the chromosome that it needs, and the embryo at some point just stops developing. So PGS will identify those embryos that have some problem with their chromosomes that are just going to stop the embryo from developing. So it's a useful test, although some clinics think that it's only useful in certain specific cases. Others think that it should be used every single time. I have my own thoughts on that, which I will share at a later date. But one of the things that PGS does do, it also will tell you if the chromosomes include an XX or an XY. So PGS will tell you if the embryos are going to result in a boy or a girl. And a lot of people choose to do PGS because they get to choose the gender of their baby, basically through PGS analysis. Once your embryos are complete, they reach their blastocyst stage, they're in storage and ready to go, then we can look for step number 2, which is finding your surrogate mother. Now, if you are doing an independent program, where do you find your surrogate mother? And this is a real problem. There are far more intended parents in the world than there are surrogates. So how do you find one? How do you match up? Well, the answer is you go on Facebook. There's really very few sort of reliable places you can go, but there are several groups on Facebook, parents seeking surrogates, surrogates seeking parents. And what you need to do is go to Facebook, join one of these groups, get involved with the group, right? Post on a regular basis, become part of the community, share your story, and hopefully your story is compelling enough that a potential surrogate is going to read it and is going to want to work with you. Now, there's definitely a benefit here for parents who have a compelling story or who somehow sort of look good on paper. And there are some non-traditional couples who are going to find a problem, right, with this because their story isn't compelling, right? Because they aren't relatable, potentially relatable to surrogate candidates. And remember, there's a lot of competition. So for every surrogate is looking at your profile, they're looking at 10 others and they're going to decide, right, who they want to work with. So if you're going to go this route, what you need is a really good story. You need to have a profile of yourselves, and you need to really sell yourself to the potential surrogates. And that means getting involved in the community and making your case and making it well. Now, if you are working with an agency, then the agency is going to be able to do all this for you. Agencies typically have a professional recruiter that's involved, and they will handle that process. Actually, there is an entire marketplace that has developed around finding surrogates. It's not a question of just you go out and find a surrogate and you make an arrangement. Agencies buy their surrogate profiles typically from a broker, and the broker has a collection of profiles that they dole out to different agencies based on the agency's need. But the brokers get their profiles from another source who is an actual recruiter who is the one actually going out and meeting with women and finding them. And in many cases, a profile can be passed from one broker to an next before it makes its way to an agency and the agency introduces it to a surrogate or to a couple, right? So that is actually a complicated business arrangement, not as simple as you might think. And when you work with an agency about finding a surrogate, keep that in mind, that there are fees. Every time a surrogate profile gets passed from one broker to another, money changes hands, right? So if you are working with an agency and they introduce you to somebody, chances are they're introducing you to somebody who they've already paid money just to get that name and that profile for you, right? So it's not cheap. Agencies do that service, but they put money up front in a lot of cases for those surrogate profiles. So what should you offer your surrogate? What will the agency offer your surrogate? Well, if you are in the United States, the base pay is $35,000 median, right? That is what most surrogates will expect as sort of their basic compensation package. Now that's outside of California. California is a different story. California has become an international hub, and thanks to the Kardashians, it is overrun with couples trying to have surrogacy babies in California, and as a result, all the expenses in California are much, much higher. So if you're getting a surrogate in California, expect that she's going to ask probably $50,000 just by virtue of the fact that she's in California and she can get it, right? Because competition is that way. Now, on top of her base pay, she is going to be entitled to certain benefits. And this is true whether you're working with an agency or you are working with a surrogate yourself. There is a benefits package that you absolutely need to provide, and it's going to run between $5,000 and $10,000. And these are things like every time that your surrogate starts taking medications, basically, when she starts a stimulation protocol, she needs to start taking daily hormone injections. Well, you need to pay her for that, right? It's not a question of she's going to do that for free. And if she gets pregnant, great, you start paying her. But if she doesn't, she's out, right? You need to pay her for the work and trouble that she goes through to try and get pregnant. So that means she gets a payment, typically about $1,000 or $1,500 just to start the medication. She gets a payment of about $1,000 or $1,500 every time she does an embryo transfer. And then she gets travel expenses and things like that in order to make the embryo transfer and the pregnancy happen. You could also expect as part of her benefits package that she's going to need medical care and insurance. And like I said before, insurance in the U.S. is going to cost between $600 and $1,200 a month. Plan on that for your budget. And that is going to be that's part of her compensation package. You can find a surrogate who has her own insurance, and that's wonderful if you do. About 10% of surrogates probably have insurance that will cover maternity care. Don't count on it. It's only 10%. And typically when a surrogate knows that she has insurance, that's friendly, surrogacy friendly, she's going to ask for $5,000 more in her compensation because she knows that she can get it, right? She knows that she's saving the parents money and she's going to want a portion of that. Then there's what we would call what if expenses. And these are things like, what if I come down with twins? What if I get pregnant with twins? Well, expect that in the US, it's going to be between $5,000 and $8,000 additional if she comes down with twins. What if there's a complication and I get an ectopic pregnancy and I lose a fallopian tube? Well, you can expect that's going to cost, as a benefit in the contract, it's just going to entitle her to maybe, $8,000 additional. What if there's a serious complication and there's a hysterectomy, $10,000, $15,000, right? Those are all what if expenses that are going to be negotiated between you and your surrogate, and those will be added to her contract. Now, once you get all of that package together, right, all of those payments and those fees are decided between you and your surrogate, you take all of that, you hand it over to a good surrogacy lawyer that is licensed in the state where the surrogate lives, right? That's the jurisdiction that matters because the baby is going to be born in close to where the surrogate lives. The jurisdiction, the laws that apply are going to be the laws of that state, and the contract needs to be drafted by a lawyer who is licensed in that state. So take all of that to a surrogacy lawyer who's practiced in that state, and he will draft that agreement. Probably he has a template, so he just plugs in the numbers and generates that. And you can probably draft, if you have all of this information and all of this negotiated in advance, probably 2 weeks later, you could get your surrogacy contract ready to sign, right? Now, once you got the agreement ready to sign, then step 3, getting pregnant. Remember, at this point, your embryos are sitting in a freezer in your IVF clinic. Your surrogate has just signed up. She is ready to go. And the first step is going to be, in getting pregnant, is going to be embryo transfer. Embryo transfer is as simple as what you think, right? They take the embryo from the freezer, they thaw it, and then they transfer it through a long catheter and gently place it inside the uterus of your surrogate. It is, at the face of it, not particularly complicated, but there is some stuff that you should know about it, right? In advance of the embryo transfer, your surrogate is going to need to be prepared. And what we would call, her fertility treatments are what we would call endometrial preparation. And these are a series of hormone injections that are intended to thicken the walls of the endometrium. The endometrium is the lining of the uterus. And this is a process that takes typically about 2 weeks, and it starts on day 1 of your surrogate's cycle. And she'll take injections every day until she reaches what we would call a maximum thickness of her endometrium. And what we're really looking for is, your clinic will be doing daily or every other day ultrasound exams of the uterus. And when the thickness reaches between 9 and 13 millimeters, then the clinic is going to give you the go-ahead to do the transfer, right? That's what we're looking for. Between 9 and 13 makes a nice, cozy home for your embryo. There are some, you will probably read, if you do some Google, you'll probably read about some trendy techniques to increase your chances of pregnancy. There are things like embryo glue, which is exactly what you think it is, right? It is a glue that they dip the embryos in, and it's supposed to make them stick to the lining of the uterus. And there are some other sort of interesting, fun things that you can read and discover on Google. But let me just say, none of them have been shown scientifically to have any real benefit in most cases. There are some procedures that you can do that have a benefit in specific cases, right? Some women, when they go through an embryo transfer, they get muscle spasms, right? And so there is a treatment to relax the walls of the uterus, to make the uterine walls more smooth and more receptive. And that works, and that's a specific treatment for a specific case, but it's not something that is going to be helpful in the vast majority of cases, right? So go ahead and go to Google and find all of the fun things that you want to find about, cute tricks and tips about improving your pregnancy rate. But I tell you, the best thing you can do is get a really good clinic that is going to do a fantastic endometrial prep, get your uterine lining, to, 9, 10, 12, 14 possibly millimeters. That's what's going to make it work, right? The better the endometrial prep, the better your chance of pregnancy. So the embryo is transferred. Your surrogate is going to travel to the clinic to get the procedure. There's going to be travel expenses to do that. The endometrial prep is probably going to happen partly in her home. It's going to be partly at the clinic. So expect that she's going to end up spending several days at the clinic and several days away from home. So there's going to be expenses there. And then about 10 days after the embryo transfer, you could expect your pregnancy test. This happens typically 10 or 12 days. And this is what we would call a chemical test or a beta HCG test. And basically HCG is a hormone, it's a pregnancy hormone. And your body, the woman's body starts producing it as a reaction to a pregnancy. And technically speaking, if your HCG level is above 25, that's an indicator of a pregnancy. But frankly, at day 10, and if I saw an HCG level at 25, I would be very skeptical. By day 10, I would expect it to be well over 100, and possibly even more than that. If you get to 200 or more than that, then I would expect that perhaps you're going to have twins. But your HCG level will double every couple of days. So it goes up really very, very quickly. And if you get a positive HCG test, the clinic will repeat that test 2 days later and see that the HCG levels are continuing to climb, right? And if they are, that's a great sign that your pregnancy is holding, that it's healthy, and that you are ready to move on to the next stage. If the HCG comes back negative, right? The baseline is about 2 or 3. If it comes down to that 2 or 3, the number is 2 or 3 instead of 25 or 125, then you repeat the embryo transfer potentially as soon as the next month with the embryos that you have in storage, right? If you have a successful IVF cycle, you should have multiple embryos that are ready and waiting for you in the freezer. The first one doesn't take, you try again with the second one. Each additional embryo transfer typically will cost you additional money. If you're in the US, probably about $5,000 additional. But remember also the surrogate gets a little bit extra for doing the embryo transfer, as well as a medication start fee. So every time that you need to repeat, expect that you're going to pay a little bit additional. There are some guarantee programs, and this is worth mentioning, that there are some clinics in the US as well as abroad that do guarantee programs, which are really not guarantee programs. A guarantee implies that they're going to give you your money back, but no. What a guarantee program is in the surrogate sense is that they will promise to do an unlimited number of embryo transfers until you have a pregnancy. So basically they charge you a much higher clinical fee, but then they will just continue to do embryo transfers for as long as you have embryos. If you have a really good guarantee program, then they will also do additional IVF cycles. So if you run out of embryos, they'll make more embryos for you as part of the fee. My personal feeling is that a clinic that says that they will do unlimited embryo transfers, but not do unlimited IVF cycles, well, that's a pretty lousy guarantee. It means that you could get if you have 6 embryos and you're transferring 2 at a time, that gives you 3 attempts before you run out of embryos and the guarantee is over, right? So what you're looking for if you're thinking about a guarantee is that it's not just embryo transfers. You want a guarantee that is going to create more embryos if you need them, right? In any case, if you get a negative result, you try again at the beginning of the next cycle. The surrogate goes through endometrial prep again, embryo transfer, and we repeat the process until you are pregnant, hopefully. So once you are pregnant, then step 4 is the pregnancy itself and prenatal care. And I mean, quite frankly, this is basically a lot of what every pregnant couple has gone through since the beginning of time. There are regularly scheduled trips to the obstetrician for ultrasound exams. There is ongoing blood work to make sure that the hormone levels are solid. There are check-ins for the various complaints that come along with pregnancy. And there are a lot of complaints that come along with pregnancy. Women, I appreciate that. So you can expect that your surrogate is going to go through a lot of office visits to her doctor, especially in the beginning of the pregnancy, right? If you are in the United States or any Western country, right, whether it's Ukraine or the UK or Canada or the US, your surrogate is going to live in her own home, right? There are programs in countries that are, let's say developing countries like Kenya, where the surrogate is put into surrogate housing, which is basically like a sorority house for pregnant women. But I have got to say that in my experience, this is a real ethical dilemma because, these women are basically kept there for 9 months. They are seriously overseen in their behavior, and their freedoms are very restricted. And when you talk to people who object to surrogacy on ethical grounds, this is one of those ethical grounds, and quite frankly, is an ethical ground that I agree with. Women should not have their freedoms taken away just because they sign a surrogacy agreement. So your surrogate should live at home. She should go to her own obstetrician, and she should continue with the relationship with that obstetrician all the way until the delivery. Now, if you are in the US, your interactions with a surrogate, or actually even your agent's interactions with a surrogate, are probably going to be through Skype, right? Because surrogates in the US, they live all over the place, and nobody is going to get on a plane and fly to see your surrogate every month just to see how she's feeling. If you are doing a program overseas, for example, in Kiev has a great sort of tradition of how they handle surrogates. They will send somebody to her home on a weekly basis to go and check up on her, to do a quick inspection of her home to make sure there's no signs that anybody's been drinking or smoking or anything like that. They will, they'll take video, they'll write up a report, they'll send you a report with photos of her in her home, and they'll do that on a weekly basis and an unannounced visit, right? So you can be very sure if you're using a program overseas that your surrogate is being looked after, even though she's in her own home. In some cases, the clinics or the agencies will actually do a blood test for alcohol or drug consumption, which I think is probably often unnecessary, but it's an option for some couples who have those types of fears. And what I also recommend is that in addition to having your agency send somebody to your surrogate's home, that you should really check in with your surrogate yourself on, say, a monthly basis. You should do a Skype call. I don't advise, giving the surrogate's phone number out to the parents in all cases, because the last thing that a surrogate needs is to have somebody pestering her with phone calls. Pregnancy is stressful enough, but the surrogate's agent should be able to arrange a monthly call with her so you can check in and see how she's doing. And that definitely helps on a number of levels. You can feel good that she's being taken care of, and she can feel good that you are definitely still involved and still planning on taking care of her throughout the pregnancy. In the US, there are additional expenses at this point, possible expenses that you may incur during the pregnancy that you should be aware of. And the big one is if the pregnancy becomes complicated, or the surrogate has some sort of problem and is advised bed rest, which is not uncommon, especially if you have twins, right? Bed rest for a twins pregnancy is very, very common. And if your surrogate is advised bed rest, then typically the intended parents are responsible for compensating for her any lost wages, which could be anywhere from a couple hundred to $1,000 a week, right? Depending on how much she's making at her work. But also if she's bedridden, then she's entitled to help for childcare. She's entitled to help for housekeeping, right? And other expenses that are related and directly related to the fact that she is stuck, in bed and can't take care of her own family, right? So that can be a lot of money, especially if bed rest goes on for several weeks or even a couple of months. Twins pregnancies, ectopic pregnancies, we've talked about those. There are always the sort of what if expenses that'll crop up during the pregnancy. So we're making it through prenatal care around week 30, 33, 34 of the pregnancy. We'll have a good idea of exactly when the baby's going to come, and we will schedule the estimated delivery date and tell the parents that they should come to the clinic or come to the surrogate's hospital, obstetrics hospital, so that they can attend the birth, right? And that leads us to step number 5, right? Once the baby is born, that is not the end of the process, right? That is the end of the medical process, but there is still a big question about your parental rights. And this is whereas the basic medical procedure is the same wherever you go, right? The medical procedure in Kiev is the same as the medical procedure in Colombia as it is in California. But what's different in each of these destinations is how you establish your parental rights. Now, let's talk a little bit about the U.S. because the U.S. Laws vary from state to state. And the way that you establish your parental rights is through a court process. And how that court process works depends on the state where the surrogate is going to be delivering. So there are in the U.S. what we would call surrogacy-friendly states, and those would be things like California and Nevada. And surrogacy-friendly states have pre-birth orders, which means that somewhere in the second trimester, typically, there's a court order that's issued that identifies the intended parents as the legal parents, right? A judge will actually issue an order that the birth certificate should be drafted with the name of the intended parents, and then it's done. Right? And then when the baby's born, the birth certificate is drafted that way, given to the intended parents, and you can go home. Easy peasy, as my kids would say. There's only a handful of really surrogacy-friendly states, perhaps 8 or 9 of those. Most states in the U.S. are what we would call somewhat friendly states, which is that they don't have pre-birth orders, they have post-birth orders. A post-birth order is identical to the pre-birth order, except it happens the week after the delivery, typically in a week or 2 after the delivery. So the baby's born, and the paperwork, your lawyer has the paperwork ready, and he submits it to the court as soon as the baby's born, and the court will issue the order to inscribe the birth certificate with the intended parent's name. Now, that means that there's probably a few days there where the surrogate is technically the legal mother, or the legal mother hasn't been identified, so it's up in the air. But that is the bulk of American states. That's how it typically works in the U.S. And I should say that's exactly how it works in Canada. That's exactly how it works, in the UK. It's how it works in most countries worldwide that have surrogacy legislation. Is that when the baby is born, the surrogate is considered to be the legal mother until there is some sort of court process, right? Now, in the U.S., there is a handful of unfriendly states, and thank God there's not that many, but they are states like New York. In New York, it's a crime to have a surrogacy contract and to and there are stiff penalties. And if you are a lawyer or an agent who is promoting a surrogacy contract, there are very serious consequences. So typically, there's a list of states you want to avoid, but most states are going to be somewhat friendly, and that's perfectly fine, right? So outside of the U.S., your baby is going to be born, in a country like Ukraine or Colombia or Canada or wherever, and the baby's going to want to return home with you. If you're American, the baby's going to want to return home with you. If you are European, for example, if you're British and your baby's born in the U.S., this is the same thing that applies, right? The baby's going to have to apply for citizenship and a passport in order to travel internationally to return home with you. Now, the process is basically two possible processes. One is that you can apply for citizenship based on your own citizenship, right? The parents can pass their citizenship on to their own child, and that requires a simple DNA test and an application at your local embassy in the country where the baby was born, right? In most cases, that will take 3 to 4 weeks. Although in the UK, there's a serious backlog, so that could take 2 or 3 months if you're a British citizen. But the process is really quite simple and straightforward if you are a resident and a citizen of a surrogacy friendly country, right, like the UK or Canada. If you are a citizen of Italy or of Spain, where surrogacy is not widely supported, then your embassy may just refuse to issue the citizenship, right, and refuse the passport, in which case you are stuck with option number 2, which is to apply for citizenship based on from the country where the child was born. So in the U.S., every child born in the U.S. is eligible for U.S. citizenship. The same thing is true in Canada, right? The same thing is true in the UK. When the baby is born, you can apply for local citizenship for the baby based on the fact that he was born in that country. And how long that takes is going to depend on the country where you're applying and the specific process of your embassy. But typically it takes about a month or so. The exception here is Ukraine, where Ukraine will not give citizenship to surrogacy babies that are born to foreigners. So if you are having a program in Ukraine, the baby has to apply for citizenship from your own country, right? So be aware of that. If your country is unfavorable to surrogacy, Ukraine may not be a good option for you, right? Once you have your citizenship and you have your passport, the baby is free to fly home. And once you're home, depending on where the baby was born and the legal situation at the time, you may decide that you have to do some additional legal processes. Depending on where the baby is born, the surrogate mother's name may still be on the birth certificate. That's true. Certainly that's true in Mexico or in Kenya. So you'll want to go through an adoption process to remove the surrogate's parental rights and replace them with the non-genetic parents. And that process is very specific to the country where you're at. That can take anywhere from a year to 5 years. And my child was born in India, and it took us 6 years to get his final adoption through the courts in Spain. So definitely that's a long process. But the good news is that it sort of happens on autopilot while you are busy, enjoying your family. So you don't, you hire a good lawyer and you sort of stick it out for the long haul while your adoption process goes through, right? And that really is the end of the surrogacy journey. Once you have your parental rights and your baby is born and he's in your arms and he is your child, your journey is then at an end. And that's where this presentation ends, right? And with that, I'm going to open the door to some questions. And I know that we have only about 10 minutes or so. So I'm going to take a look and see what questions we may have. Here's a question. Let's see. in Canada, is the base pay to the surrogate prepaid ahead of time or only upon success? Typically in the U.S., you may be aware of this. In the U.S., the local laws typically require that the surrogate's entire compensation package be paid into escrow. Not all foreign countries have that requirement, and the laws in Canada they differ from state to state. So I'm not sure if escrow requirement is a legal requirement by the state in Canada, but almost all reputable surrogacy agencies will require this, right? They will do it because they need to protect their surrogates, and they need to show the surrogates that they are going to be protected by making sure that the full compensation is there and ready for them, and that there is zero risk that somehow the surrogate is going to get stuck with medical bills, or she's not going to get paid according to her contract. So whether you are doing a program in the US or Canada, you should expect that the surrogate's compensation, at least, is going to need to be paid upfront, or at least into some sort of an escrow account. LGBT couples, let's see. Canada is an interesting story. Technically speaking, Canada is open to all couples, and it's in the U.S. Like in the U.S., they're very the laws are very favorable and non-discrimination against LGBT couples. The problem with Canada is that it's what we call an altruistic destination, altruistic jurisdiction, which means that there are restrictions on commercial activity revolving your surrogacy program. It is, for example, illegal to provide professional surrogacy services, right? That will manage your surrogate, or that will go out and recruit your surrogate, or that will advertise for your surrogate. Right? Those are all commercial activities, and they are technically prohibited in Canada. Surrogates are also, some people think altruistic surrogacy means that they can't get paid. No, surrogates get paid, but they get paid, technically they're supposed to get paid only for their expenses. So their compensation is lower than what you would see in the US. But all of that together means that it is really difficult to find surrogates in Canada, especially because it's become such a sort of a popular destination. So it takes a very, very long time to find surrogates in Canada. And what I have gotten from my colleagues at different agencies in Canada is that it takes anywhere from 6 to 18 months. Now, if, like I said in the US, when we were talking about finding a surrogate through, for an independent journey, some couples will have a good time in Canada because they are a traditional couple that is relatable to your surrogate. And because the surrogate typically has several couples to choose from, if you have a compelling story, Canada may work for you, right? You may have some luck there. But if you're a non-traditional parent, and this is true sometimes for same-sex couples, it's definitely true for single parents, that you may have a difficult time finding a surrogate who's willing to work with you over working with the couple next to you who have a really tragic and compelling fertility story that the surrogate is going to relate to, right? So, the problem with Canada really isn't the legal framework. The problem with Canada is really the search for surrogates. There's also something that is new in Canada, and that is that as of this past month, the government there is revisiting and upping enforcement of their restrictions on surrogate expenses. They used to be very lax about what could be construed as an expense for the surrogate, and there were a lot of sort of agency fees and things that were put in as expenses. That is, by the end of the year, is supposed to go away. So the surrogate is only going to be allowed to get paid actual expenses that she can present a receipt for, right? So that basically is going to do away with sort of the idea of a base pay in Canada, and that basically she's only going to get paid for receipts that she can provide. Now, how that works out, I don't know, because that is um, still being rolled out, right? There's new enforcement, but my guess is that there's going to be substantial changes to the way agencies work in Canada over the next 6 months. Um, if here's another question. So, um, if surrogacy does not result in a pregnancy, what portion of the payment still gets paid? You should not need to pay for any procedure that was not performed. So, in the case of a failed pregnancy test, right, the HCG test is negative and continues to be negative, you are going to be on the hook for the IVF cycle, right, the fertilization of the embryos and the conception of the embryos. You're going to be on the hook for the embryo transfer and multiple embryo transfers, possibly, as well as the payments to the surrogate. Remember, she gets paid every time she goes through an embryo transfer or starts medication. And then probably your agency fees are going to be included in that too. So that's what you're on the hook for. What you would not be on the hook for is any of the surrogate's compensation regarding the pregnancy itself, or any payments that are intended to cover the prenatal care of the surrogate or the oversight of the surrogate. Now, how your agency breaks that down is going to depend on your agency, but you should not have to pay the full amount. You'll probably end up paying like half of what your budget is, because probably about half of your budget is going to the clinic procedures, agency fees, and those initial expenses to your surrogate for starting your cycle and doing an embryo transfer. In terms of, well, there's a lot of questions here, and I'm not going to be able to get to them. But first, let me say, if you have questions, send them to me in email, and we're happy to refresh those and go over those with you by email or even talking with a consultant. But about known egg donors, if you know somebody who's interested in being an egg donor, that's great. That's wonderful. It'll save you a lot of money. Egg donors in the United States, an egg donor fee is going to cost probably between $16,000 and $20,000 for an egg donor in the U.S. And if you know somebody who can do that for you, wonderful. But before you go down that road and say, yes, we're going to do this, she's going to donate for us, you need to do the blood test. You need to get the hormones tests done. You need to get the ovarian ultrasound scan done, because quite frankly, it's not as easy as you think qualifying as an egg donor. First of all, anybody who's over 30 should probably not be an egg donor, right? Unless you're donating for your own IVF cycle and you have an emotional reason why you want to use your own eggs. Women over 30, the success rates of a egg retrieval begin to drop off precipitously. So if you're looking for an egg donor and you have somebody who's interested, hopefully they're going to be in their 20s. If they're over 30, then you definitely want to get some serious medical evaluation to make sure that they are going to give you a good result. And we just reached the 1 hour mark. and I'm going to have to call it there, but I really appreciate everybody attending. There are going to be a series of webinars in the future, and so I hope that I'm going to see you there. If you have a question, you can send us an email to info@sensiblesurrogacy.com. And if you just want to know more about any of the topics that we talked about, go to the Surrogacy Guide on the Sensible Surrogacy website, right? The Sensible Surrogacy Guide. And there is a searchable database of articles and posts and some experiences that should probably cover every possible question you could have. So that's a great resource. If you haven't checked it out, the Sensible Surrogacy Guide, go to sensiblesurrogacy.com. The guide is there. And like I said, it's completely searchable, so it's a great first place to start. All right, and with that, thank you very much, everybody. And I hope I see you at the next webinar.